Before we begin, we want to make it clear that here at Plough of Twist, we believe in equality, respect and justice for all. Racism, in any form, is unacceptable, and this channel is committed to promoting stories that value the voices and experiences of people of color. We know how important it is to see representation and support in all narratives, and that's why we're here, together. Follow this exciting story and prepare for an unforgettable twist. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Good story. A wealthy lady saw a black homeless man sitting on the sidewalk, his eyes downcast and his shoulders hunched over from the weight of cold and hunger. Her steps hesitated for a moment, but something about his appearance made her stop. There was a disconcerting familiarity to the dirty, haggard figure before her, a shadow from the past that awoke an uneasy feeling. She, a woman who has always prided herself on her generosity, approached slowly, a plate of food in hand, feeling her heart beat faster without understanding exactly why. That person's misery was evident. His torn clothes, grimy face and unshaven beard revealed years of abandonment, an existence that seemed far from dignity. With a quick, automatic gesture, she held out the plate, as she occasionally did, in an attempt to calm her own conscience. And then, as if performing a habitual act of charity, she decided to ask, more out of curiosity than compassion, what had led the man to that situation. The answer came in an almost inaudible whisper, filled with a pain that resonated in a familiar way in some forgotten corner of his memory. The voice, although weakened, carried an undertone she couldn't ignore. Something inside her began to stir, as if the words were part of an ancient melody she hadn't heard in a long time. Her hand shook slightly as she handed over the plate, her eyes fixed on the man who slowly looked up and looked at her. It was at that moment that everything changed. The shock that crossed the woman's face was impossible to hide. She knew that man. Not as someone who had once crossed her path unimportantly, but as someone who had been central to her life, many years ago, in a time she preferred not to remember. In that instant, the memories she had buried began to emerge, bringing to light a time when her decisions were guided by prejudice, by fear of what others might think. She had left true love behind, giving in to the pressures of society that would never have accepted a union between her, a privileged white woman, and him, an honorable black man, but without the status she needed to preserve. Recognition was instantaneous, but acceptance took a little longer. Her mind refused the idea that the man who had once meant so much to her was now here, reduced to a state of complete humiliation. What made her feel worse was not just his decline, but the fact that she had played a role in his decline, even if she had never consciously wanted it. She knew deep down that her choices contributed to what he had become. These choices she justified as being the best for both of them, but which, in reality, only served to preserve the world of comfort and appearances in which she lived. As she stared at that man, something deeper began to form within her. A mix of guilt and fear. She feared what he might say, what he knew about her, what he might reveal. She feared that everything she had built over the years, her riches, her impeccable reputation, was at risk. The past, which she believed was buried, was now before her, in the flesh, personified in the figure of that man she had loved so much, but whom she had betrayed in an unforgivable way. He said nothing, but his eyes told a story of pain and betrayal that words could not express. The silence between them prolonged, heavy as an unspoken condemnation. And then, as if coming out of a trance, the woman took a step back, feeling the ground open up beneath her feet. She was on the edge of an abyss she had dug herself long ago, and now there was nowhere to run. The question that hung in the air, silent but deafening, was, what would he do with this truth? It was clear he remembered everything. Every word, every broken promise, every look of contempt she had cast under the pressure of those around her. What did he want now? Revenge? Forgiveness? Or just an opportunity to finally speak your truth? The woman felt her stomach turn. She knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, but she also knew she couldn't continue living with this specter haunting her. Something terrible and, at the same time, redemptive was about to happen. She would need to face the consequences of her actions from a past she would rather forget. And you, who are following this story, are about to discover that the past never really disappears. He just waits for the right moment to emerge, bringing with him everything we try to hide. Stay with us to discover how this unexpected encounter between the present and the past will forever change the lives of these two characters. Believe me, this story is still far from over. Richmond, Virginia, a city marked by its history, carried the weight of a divisive past at every turn. The large old houses, the tree-lined parks, the avenues where time seemed to flow more slowly, everything exuded an air of tradition and conservatism. It was in this environment, where appearances mattered more than reality, that an imposing figure commanded his world with implacable firmness, Meredith Lawson. Widow of an influential lawyer, Meredith had inherited a substantial fortune and a social position that she guarded tooth and nail. For many, she was the perfect example of philanthropy and generosity, but her heart bore scars that no one imagined. Meredith was a woman of strict habits. Her days began early, with a walk through the gardens of her immense property, where she precisely controlled every detail, from the arrangement of the flowers to the impeccable cutting of the grass. In her daily activities, she surrounded herself with people who reflected her worldview, with a polite facade but always attentive to what others said or thought about her. In his mind, keeping up appearances was more than a priority, it was a matter of survival. That morning, however, something was troubling her. A restlessness she couldn't define bothered her from the moment her feet touched the floor. She felt out of place, as if something was out of place, but she wasn't sure what it was. It was with this strange feeling that she decided to go for one of her solitary walks around the city center, a routine that, from time to time, made her feel connected to reality beyond the walls of her mansion. As her footsteps echoed across the cobblestone streets of Richmond, Meredith kept her gaze firmly ahead, avoiding any eye contact with passers-by who weren't part of her social circle. However, that morning, something caught his attention. On a corner, huddled and practically invisible to all but those who bothered to really look, stood a man. He wasn't young, but he didn't look old either, his dark skin was scarred from years of sun and suffering. He was wearing torn, dirty clothes that barely protected him from the growing cold of November. She stopped, on an impulse she couldn't explain, and watched him from a distance. For a moment, there was something familiar about that defeated posture, but Meredith quickly shook the thought away. After all, how could someone so different from her look familiar? She, who had always surrounded herself with the best, who had always known how to choose the right people, would never cross paths with someone like that man. However, something in his lost and empty look made her hesitate. The approach was almost automatic. Meredith, always vain and careful, now found herself driven by an impulse that defied her own logic. When the man looked up, she saw up close his eyes that reflected a deep sadness, an abyss of pain and abandonment. The two of them stood there, in silence, as the biting cold made the air thicker, and for a moment that seemed to last longer than it should have, she felt an inexplicable connection, something that disturbed her usual serenity. But who was this man? His name was Elijah. Once a proud man full of dreams, Elijah was a talented pianist, whose skill on the instrument had the power to bring tears to tears from the toughest of listeners. Born and raised in Richmond, he knew the best and worst that life had to offer. As a young man, his nimble fingers gave life to compositions that spoke of love, pain and hope. However, he knew that opportunities for a black man like him were limited, even if his talent was undeniable. It was in the early 80s that he met Meredith. She, young and ambitious, frequented the most refined social circles, where classical music was appreciated as a status symbol. It was at one of these events, a rainy night in one of the most prestigious halls in the city, that their eyes met for the first time. Elijah, at the piano, played with his soul, and Meredith, enchanted, couldn't look away. That night marked the beginning of something intense, but doomed from the beginning. They met in secret, in remote places, where no one would suspect. But the relationship, full of passion and tension, soon encountered the insurmountable barrier of social expectations. Prejudice was not just in others, it was embedded in the walls of Meredith's own home, and, overwhelmed by the pressure, she made the easiest, and cruelest, choice. Now, decades later, fate brought them face to face again. But Elijah was no longer the vibrant man he once was. The years were hard on him. Lost opportunities, constant discrimination and a series of wrong choices led him to a life of misery. Music, which was once his life, was abandoned along with his dreams, replaced by a daily fight for survival. The only thing that remained was the deep resentment for the injustices that the world had imposed on him, injustices that, in part, began with that woman who now looked at him with a mixture of horror and recognition. Richmond, with its silent traditions and hierarchies, served as the setting for this unexpected reunion. A city that preserved its past with as much fervor as its prejudices. There, where everything seemed immutable, the past and present were about to collide in ways no one could predict. The meeting between Meredith and Elijah wasn't just a coincidence, it was a bitter irony, an opportunity to confront truths they both preferred to keep buried. In the cold of that morning, without any words being spoken, a cycle was about to close. The silence between the two, filled with everything that hadn't been said in years, was the harbinger of an approaching storm, a storm that would spare no one. Time had been cruel, but there was still one last score left to be played, a melody of revenge, repentance, and, perhaps, redemption. Meredith couldn't sleep. The image of Elijah, so different from the man she once knew, wouldn't leave her head. That morning had turned her insides in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The unexpected reunion led her to reflect on everything she had done to get where she was, and, for the first time in a long time, these reflections did not bring her comfort. However, the feeling that dominated her was not just guilt. It was also fear. A fear that was born of the possibility that Elijah could reveal her past, expose her darkest secrets and destroy the reputation she had worked so hard to build and maintain. The consequences of such a revelation would be devastating. She knew she needed to act, but she didn't know how. The next day, Meredith found herself drawn back to the same place where she had found Elijah, as if something greater than herself compelled her to confront him once again. With each step, his heart beat faster, and his mind filled with questions. What did he want? Why was she there, on that corner, and why hadn't he looked for her directly? When she saw him, sitting in the same miserable position, her stomach dropped. She approached cautiously, the smell of the street and desperation making the air around her heavy. Elijah slowly raised his head when he noticed her presence, his eyes half closed by the daylight that seemed an insult to the darkness his life had become. "What do you want from me?" Meredith asked finally, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. Elijah took a while to respond, as if he was considering whether it was worth exposing his emotions to someone he knew was so different from him. He began, his voice hoarse and brittle. "What do I want from you?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Nothing, Meredith. Nothing you can give me, at least." She felt a lump in her throat as she heard her name leaving his lips, loaded with all the weight of the past. There was a time when that voice made her tremble with passion, now it made her tremble with fear. "Then why are you here?" she insisted, trying to regain control of the situation. He looked at her with an expression that mixed pain and contempt. "I'm here because I have nowhere else to go. This city, this is where it all started for me, and it seems only right that this is where it ends." Meredith realized that the bitterness in his words was directed as much at fate as at her. She felt a chill run down her spine when she realized that he still blamed her for what had happened. And how could I not blame? You don't understand, Meredith. Never understood. You live in a world where you can shape things to your advantage, where you can bury the past and move on, but for me, there is no escape. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. You broke me. It broke everything I was, and when I needed you, you chose to safeguard your own skin. She wanted to defend herself, to say that circumstances forced her to, that she was young and under pressure, but she knew that these were excuses that he would not accept. And deep down, she also knew that those weren't enough excuses. "I did what I thought was best for both of us," she said, the words sounding empty even to her. Elijah shook his head, a sad smile distorting his lips. "The best for both? Or what's best for you?" He sighed deeply, as if the discussion was just a formality he needed to get through before getting to the crucial point. "Anyway, I'm not here to blame you, Meredith. I'm here because you need to understand something." She stayed silent, waiting for him to continue, fearing what was to come. "I never looked for you, because I knew deep down you would never look at me again," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But now that you found me, the past can no longer stay buried. I didn't want you to see me like this, but maybe it was necessary." Meredith felt a chill as he spoke, as if each word were a noose tightening around her neck. "Necessary?" she asked, with a barely audible voice. "Yes." Elijah leaned back, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he saw something far beyond the city that stretched out in front of them. "There's one last thing you need to know, Meredith. Something I never told you, something I kept for years." He paused, and time seemed to stop. Meredith felt her heart beating wildly, her breath catching in her throat. Everything around him disappeared, and the only thing that mattered was what Elijah would say next. "In the end, it wasn't just you who made painful choices. I did mine too," he said, his eyes returning to her. "You weren't the only one to sacrifice something. I made a sacrifice you never knew, a sacrifice that changed everything." Meredith's eyes widened, fear turning into unbearable anxiety. "What are you saying, Elijah?" she whispered, terror beginning to take over her mind. He looked at her, his gaze hardened with grief but still charged with a truth she had never suspected. "I walked away, Meredith. Not for me, but for you. I knew our relationship was becoming unsustainable, that the rumors were growing. So, I did what I thought I should do to protect you. I left because I knew that if we continued, you would lose everything. Your family, your status, your life. I left to save you, and that's what destroyed me." She was in shock. Elijah's words took root deep in her mind, destroying the certainties she had held for so many years. He had sacrificed his happiness, his love, his life, for her. And what did she do? He turned his back and moved on, as if he were just a page turned in his story. Meredith felt a tear run down her face, but she quickly wiped it away. He couldn't allow himself to show weakness, not now. But inside her, everything was falling apart. Elijah's sacrifice hit her like a blow to the gut. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Nothing she said could erase what had been done, or what had left unsaid. Elijah stood up slowly, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked at Meredith one last time, and she saw in his eyes not the man he had been, but the man he could have been, if the circumstances had been different, if the choices had been different. "I didn't come to you to make you feel bad, Meredith," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I came because I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that, in the end, you weren't the only one to pay the price for our choices." He started to walk away, but stopped after a few steps. Without turning around, he spoke for the last time. "Now, I say goodbye, Meredith. I don't expect you to forgive me, just as I don't expect you to offer me forgiveness. What I hope is that you live with it. May you remember what I did for you, and what you didn't do for me." And with that, he walked away, leaving Meredith alone on the sidewalk, with the revelation echoing in her mind, devastating her carefully constructed world. She lay there, paralyzed, as the morning chill penetrated her bones, unable to move, unable to think, only feeling the crushing weight of what had just happened. The shock Meredith felt upon hearing Elijah's words sent her into a daze. She stood there, motionless, as his figure disappeared into the distance. His words echoed in her mind, shattering every layer of self-defense she had built up over the years. For the first time in a long time, she found herself confronted not just with the past, but with the stark reality of her choices. Meredith tried to return to her normal life, but Elijah's words had done something deeper than just bring back bitter memories. They had broken something inside her. Every time she tried to ignore what happened, the image of Elijah sacrificing himself for her, and her abandoning him for her own safety, came back with overwhelming force. She couldn't find peace. Days passed, but for Meredith, it was as if time had stopped at that fateful moment. The hours dragged by, and the nights were filled with dreams and nightmares in which Elijah stared at her, accusing, silent but implacable. Every corner of the city, every song she heard, every image from the past seemed to scream his name. She couldn't escape. Finally, unable to bear the pressure, Meredith made a decision. I knew I couldn't continue living like this. She needed to face Elijah, to fully understand what he had sacrificed for her, what she had truly lost in that buried past. With a heavy heart, she prepared to meet him one last time, this time not as a distant figure from the past, but as a human being who needed to find a way to redeem himself. She found him again, this time in a makeshift homeless shelter. Elijah was there, surrounded by others who shared his fate, or lack thereof. He looked even more aged, as if the previous revelation had drained the last of his strength. When their eyes met, Meredith saw deep sadness in his eyes, but also something she hadn't noticed before, resignation. He had accepted his fate, and that was something she couldn't bear. She approached slowly, each step fraught with hesitation. Elijah looked up but said nothing. He just watched, as if he knew she had more to say, that this story wasn't over yet. And in fact, there wasn't. Elijah, she began, her voice shaking, I need to talk to you. He remained silent, but his gaze allowed her to continue. Meredith sat next to him, discomfort evident in her posture. It wasn't the environment she was used to, but at that moment, none of that mattered. I thought a lot about what you said, about the sacrifice you made, she said, feeling her throat tighten. I never knew. I never imagined you would have done this for me. Elijah looked at her, his gaze hard but without the anger she expected. And what would you do if you knew? He asked, his voice filled with bitter wisdom. Would anything have changed? Meredith didn't have an answer for that. She knew probably not. At the time, the fear of losing everything he had, the pressure from his family, society, all of this would have had even more weight than anything else. And that was the painful truth she needed to admit. I don't know, she said, lowering her gaze. But that doesn't change what you did. You sacrificed yourself for me, and I left you behind. Elijah sighed deeply, as if her words were a light breeze in a barren desert. You did what you thought you needed to do, Meredith, he said finally. Just like me. But our paths should never have crossed again. I forgave you for that a long time ago, because I needed to move on, even if I had nowhere to go. She felt a little relieved, but at the same time, she felt the weight of what she can never fix. She realized that Elijah's forgiveness did not free her, because the blame was on herself. He had moved on, but she hadn't. He had paid the price, but she still lived in the shadow of this unresolved debt. Elijah, she began again, her voice almost cracking, I can't change the past, but I can do something for you now. I want to help. I want to try to make up for everything I did, in some way. He looked at her, and she noticed that for the first time there was a different gleam in his eyes, as if he were pondering the possibility. But then he shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. There's no making up for the past, Meredith. What has been done is done. I don't need your charity now, any more than I needed it before. What I needed, you couldn't give me. And what I gave you, I never asked for anything in return. She felt the ground open beneath her feet again. But this time, it was different. She realized that this was not about charity, nor about redemption. It was about something bigger, something she had lost sight of for a long time, humanity, connection with others. Elijah had been the great love of her life, and she had traded that for something that now seemed so insignificant. Finally, after a long silence, Elijah stood up. He looked at her one last time, and this time, there was no bitterness, just a calm acceptance of what could not be changed. "Take care of yourself, Meredith. Don't let the past devour you. I've already made peace with mine." And with those words, he walked away, leaving Meredith alone with her thoughts, with the weight of the past finally revealed. She knew Elijah wouldn't come back. Their story had come to an end, but the marks it left would last forever. And now, she would have to live with that. Meredith returned home with an empty feeling she couldn't describe. Meeting Elijah had brought to the surface a series of emotions that she had spent years trying to suppress. The revelation of her sacrifice, the realization that he had suffered not just because of her, but by it shook his foundations. There was no longer any way to ignore the weight of your choices. What was once a seemingly perfect life now seemed like a fragile construction, about to crumble. In the weeks that followed, Meredith found herself increasingly lost in thought, reliving that last encounter with Elijah in her mind, trying to find a path that would lead to redemption. But the more I thought, the more I realized there was no easy answer. The question that now tormented her was not just how she could redeem herself, but whether she could deserve redemption. The dilemmas that haunted her turned into an unbearable burden. As a woman who had always lived surrounded by luxury and privilege, Meredith now found herself facing a brutal reality. Her choices, all based on protecting herself, had destroyed the life of someone she once loved. The revelation of Elijah's sacrifice brought to the surface a deep internal conflict. She had lived a lifetime based on appearances, but what was left of those appearances when the truth emerged? As he walked through the long hallways of his mansion, every detail of the house seemed to have lost its luster. The pictures on the walls, the antique furniture, the expensive rugs, all of it now seemed empty, meaningless. Every object, every memory, was a reminder of her choices and everything she sacrificed to maintain her position. And the most painful thing was knowing that, despite everything, Elijah's life had been torn apart, while she continued to live in comfort and security. The moral dilemma that now gnawed at her was clear: she could continue her life as if nothing had changed, maintaining the facade of respectability, or she could finally confront the reality of what she had done. But there was something deeper that she needed to confront. Could she really redeem herself? Or was she doomed to carry this weight forever? Meredith's anguish intensified as she began to realize there was no simple solution. She couldn't undo the past. Helping Elijah now felt like a hollow attempt to alleviate his own guilt. The generous donations that were once part of her philanthropic routine now seemed like meaningless gestures, unable to compensate for the deep wounds she had caused. But perhaps the hardest aspect to face was the realization that deep down, she had never really known Elijah. She had fallen in love with the idea of who he could be, with his talent, with his passion, but when she was put to the test, she chose to protect herself. Elijah, on the other hand, had understood something deeper about love, a love that required no rewards or guarantees. He had sacrificed everything for her, not because he expected anything in return, but because he believed that this was the only way to save her from the social consequences of their relationship. Now, with everything revealed, Meredith was forced to face the mirror and see who she really was. The question that consumed her was simple but painful: how to move forward knowing that she was not the hero of her own story, but the villain. And, more importantly, what should she do now? These questions led her to reconsider what it meant to truly face the past. Perhaps the only way to begin repairing the damage was to admit, publicly, what had happened. But that would mean destroying the life she knew, exposing her own flaws and weaknesses to the world. Could Meredith, a woman who has always valued image, sacrifice that in the name of truth? And yet, there was a cruel irony to it all. While Elijah had been destroyed for sacrificing everything to protect her, Meredith now faced the prospect of destroying herself to repair the harm she had caused. But unlike him, who had no choice, she would have to make a deliberate, conscious choice about what really mattered to her. As Meredith pondered these questions, she realized there was no easy path. Any decision he made would have painful consequences. But what was becoming increasingly clear was that she could no longer ignore what had happened. Perhaps the true sacrifice she needed to make was not for Elijah, but for herself, an attempt to finally find a sliver of peace amid the storm she herself had created. This new realization placed her at a crossroads. There was no way to return to the life she knew, but moving forward would require courage that she didn't yet know she possessed. Meredith was facing the most defining moment of her life, and the choices she would make from now on would define not only her future, but also the legacy she would leave behind. So the final question hanging in the air was inevitable: would Meredith be able to sacrifice her own comfortable life to do what was right? Or would she continue to live in the shadows, allowing the past to slowly consume her? The answers to these questions were closer than she imagined, and time to decide was running out. Meredith spent weeks immersed in her own reflections, trying to find a way out of the moral maze in which she found herself. The truth about Elijah had shaken all of his convictions, and the weight of his past choices had become unbearable. During this time, an idea began to form in her mind, something that seemed crazy at first, but the more she considered it, the more it made sense. Finally, on a cold December morning, Meredith made her decision. There was no more room for hesitation or fear. She knew what she needed to do. That afternoon, she summoned the local press and announced that she would make an important statement. Speculations ran wild, but no one could have imagined what she was about to reveal. In the large living room of her mansion, in front of cameras and microphones, Meredith looked out at the audience and took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. All my life, I hid behind a facade of perfection, she began, her voice firm. But this facade was built on secrets and lies, on selfish choices that destroyed the life of a person I loved deeply. Today, I am here to confess these mistakes and try, in some way, to correct the harm I caused. The audience was silent as Meredith revealed her past with Elijah, the love they shared, and the sacrifice he made for her. She held nothing back, describing how her choice to abandon him to preserve her social status had destroyed his life. Every word was a blade that cut deep, but she knew there was no turning back. I know that nothing I say or do now can erase what happened, she continued, her voice shaking slightly. But I can't live with this weight anymore. That's why I'm donating my entire fortune to organizations that support homeless people and marginalized communities. I will sell this house and all my possessions, and from today onwards, I will dedicate my life to helping those who need it most. This is the only way I have found to try to repair the harm I caused. The statement caused an immediate shock. The press, the city, everyone was stunned by what they heard. Meredith, who had always been seen as an impenetrable and controlled figure, now stripped herself of all her power and privilege in the name of redemption. But the true impact of Meredith's decision was felt later when the news reached Elijah. He, who had lived so long in anonymity and pain, learned of the sacrifice she had made in his honor. When he heard the story, his eyes filled with tears. He did not desire revenge, nor the destruction of Meredith. All he had ever wanted was to be remembered, to be recognized for what he had done. And now, in a way he never expected, it had happened. Elijah didn't come back to look for Meredith. He knew her decision was sincere, but he also knew that their paths had parted forever. Instead, he found new strength within himself. Using money from the sale of an old property he still owned, Elijah opened a small community center in the heart of Richmond, where he began teaching music to children and youth in the community. He returned to playing the piano, but this time, not to impress rich audiences, but to inspire those who needed it most. In the following months, Meredith, now without her former wealth, lived simply. She started working at a local organization, helping homeless people get back on their feet. The work was hard, but for the first time in a long time, she felt genuine peace. The sleepless nights eased, and although the weight of the past would never be completely lifted, she knew she was on the right path. Meredith and Elijah's story spread throughout the city, becoming a legend about repentance, sacrifice, and redemption. People began to see in Meredith not just the rich woman who had fallen, but someone who had finally found true purpose in helping others. Elijah, in turn, became a symbol of resilience and forgiveness, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, it is possible to find a new path. This story teaches us that regardless of the choices we make, it is sincere repentance and the effort to correct mistakes that define who we truly are. Meredith and Elijah followed different paths, but both found, in their own way, a way to make peace with the past. And you, if you were in Meredith or Elijah's shoes, what would you do? How would you deal with the weight of regret or the sacrifice of great love? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about the lessons we can take from this story and how they apply to our lives. And if you liked this story full of twists and emotions, don't forget to subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire and make you think. Until the next story.